Thanks, Ollie. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, thanks for coming. And yes, so we're going to start off by talking about your theory of emerging adulthood as a starting point. So tell us, how has the theory of emerging adulthood, and indeed the paradigm that sits around it now with thousands of scholars, how do you feel that that's evolved in recent years?
It's becoming more and more international, which pleases me greatly. I mean, from the beginning, I saw this as an international phenomenon. It certainly is demographically. Even when I first began becoming interested in it 30 years ago, there was already a trend toward later education and more people getting tertiary education around the world, later marriage, later parenthood. So I always saw it as an international theory, but I was just at the Society for the Study of Emerging Adulthood meeting that we had last week, and it was very exciting to see what's going on all over the world in emerging adulthood research and really talented people worldwide who are doing emerging adulthood research. Just to give you a couple of examples, one of the winners of the dissertation award was a young man from the Philippines who was doing research on skin lightening practices among emerging adults in the Philippines. And he'd done this wonderful mixed methods dissertation on this. And there was another young man from India who was doing quite fascinating research. He runs a nonprofit there. He's not actually an academic. He runs a nonprofit there that is devoted to promoting flourishing among the next generation of young leaders in India. And then just to give a third example, there was a young woman from Canada. She's Arab Canadian, and she was doing research, mainly qualitative research on Arab Canadian identity among emerging adults there. So those are just three examples. There are a ton of other ones from that conference, and that's very exciting to see, very gratifying to me because I always wanted it to be an international field.
Thanks for that. Yeah, and I've seen that there's recent work with yourself collaborating with others from China, Kenya, India, and Pakistan over the last maybe 3 years. I've seen articles. So let's take each one in turn. What was the take home from the work in China, as you recall?
I've done a lot of collaborating with people in China. There's a woman there, Xinxing Deng, and she has been interested in emerging adulthood for almost as long as I have. She became interested in it very early. She invited me to China a couple of times, and she was really interested in how she saw it happening in China. And eventually, one of her um, students, Juan Zhang, came to work with me at Clark as a graduate student and wrote a wonderful dissertation on young women in China who were migrating from their rural villages to the urban areas to work in factories. And she wrote that dissertation about 10 years ago and has been publishing papers from it. And it's quite wonderful. It's amazing to read about them. I mean, their experience of emerging adulthood is really different than anything I had come across in my research. And it was really interesting to see how individualistic they were actually in moving to the cities and having dreams of their own to succeed in these urban areas and get out of their little villages. But they were also quite collectivistic too, because many of them were sending a lot of their income home to their families in the village so that younger siblings could go to school. That's one of the
Hmm.
most fascinating things. And then in recent years, I've been working with other people in China, looking at current trends in young Chinese and their aspirations, as well as their views of this decade of their lives.
Very interesting. And so, did you get the sense in China that with this as you say, this very prevalent demographic shift of young people moving into the cities, that their choice to perhaps defer non-work related commitments was in order so that they could make a success of this, whether they're working in an Apple factory, whatever it might be, so they're having to wait until they were financially stable. Is that coming out of as far as you're aware?
Yeah, I think so in a way. I think what one of the notable things related to that Juan found in her dissertation and her subsequent research is that they move to the cities to work in the factories, but they don't plan to be working in factories for the next 40 years. They have aspirations beyond that. Many
Yeah.
of them had an aspiration of starting a small business, a food cart or something, or making things that they would then sell. And that was fascinating to hear because I've heard so many accounts of high aspirations and creative futures among emerging adults in the US, where I've mainly done my research. And it was interesting to see a parallel kind of version of this among the young Chinese. They didn't just aspire to work in the factories and make more money than their parents had in working in agricultural work in the villages. They had these creative hopes of their own for some kind of small business.
Thanks. Um, yes, right. So an in-between age in China, in the sense that they may find themselves in a job which they specifically intend to be short term, but may provide a launch pad to whatever comes after that for them. But it provides that kind of entry point. So, what about the research in India and Pakistan? Any standout stuff from there?
Boy, there's a lot. I have another fabulous graduate student, now former graduate student, Dia Mitra. She may actually be here today. I know you
Cheers.
know her, Ollie, and she's just done great stuff and is doing great stuff. There, I have longtime colleague there, Shagufa Kapadia, who's doing research on young Indians. I mentioned the young man I met at SSEA this time. His name is Amrut Bang. Keep an eye out for him because he's super sharp. Again, he's not an academic, but he's doing really good research. And I've offered to him to collaborate to try to publish some of what he's doing because I think it would be of great interest to emerging adulthood researchers and really all researchers on adulthood, including ESRAD members around the world. So those are some of the things that are going on there.
Hmm. Yeah, this the what related to this. I'm going to show you actually a kind of a graph, a figure, because this relates to this internationalization or the link between international experiences, international movement, migration, and emerging adulthood. I'll just go into a quick screen share. Can you see that? It looks like a kind
Yes,
of Christmas tree shape. Now this is it's the age of migration into and within Europe. And on the left is males and on the right is females. The males and the females have a very similar pattern, hence it being very symmetrical. But what we can see there is that with a movement into Europe and within Europe, there is this very, very clear pattern. And by the way, this is completely consistent over decades. You get exactly the same pattern 10 years before. You get this peak age of migration around the age of 25. And it makes perfect sense that the theory of emerging adulthood fits with the prevalence of migration in that exact age range,
it
given
sure does.
given
Fascinating. And
yeah,
I bet that would be the same pattern all over the world, Ali, not just in Europe. I don't know if you've looked at it worldwide, but
yeah.
Uh, somebody's probably written an article about this, or certainly somebody should. It makes sense that the decade of the 20s and that emerging adulthood period is the age when people migrate because they're capable of doing it in the way of, let's say, a 15-year-old is not. And yet they're not entrenched into the commitments of adult life the way a 35 or 45-year-old is. It's hard for somebody in their 30s and beyond to move because they have so many obligations that hold them to that place where they have begun their adult lives. But a 25-year-old typically doesn't have those commitments. And so,
Well, not in the contemporary European world. No, exactly. They've
no,
deferred sufficiently to make that kind of enormous decision, which you can't if you've put your roots down age 19, 20.
exactly. And I've emphasized for decades, as I think you know, the 20s as the true age of identity explorations.
Yeah.
Erickson associated, of course, with adolescence, but I think even Erickson would agree now that it's really in the 20s when that's happening. And that means choices in love and work that most people around the world now have not made by age 25. And so
Mm.
they want to give themselves more opportunities for those choices. They want to give themselves a greater range of identity choices in both love and work. I think that's one way to interpret this. And so again, they're competent, they're capable of making that move in the way of a 15-year-old or a 5-year-old is not. And so that makes sense then that that's a time of making that big move. It's a move for more identity choices in both love and work, but it's really a move about your cultural identity too. If you migrate from a place like India or China or Africa or South America to somewhere in Europe, to take your example, it's not just a change in your possible futures in love and work, it's a change in your cultural identity. You may retain that cultural identity from where you grew up, but it's going to change if you move to somewhere in Europe where it's a totally different society, a totally different set of expectations as well as possibilities.
Yeah, and we have people here present today who have moved to a new country in their 20s, and perhaps we can hear from them later after the interview. I expect many, I know of a few people here who moved around the age of 25, internationally, intercontinentally in some instances. Um, and yeah, so and I think what's very interesting for future research from my perspective is understanding the emotional dynamics of migration, because my anecdotally, when I speak to people, it often the decision to migrate often follows a period of crisis where a young adult, an emerging adult, or as individually or as a couple decides that this can't go on, something has to change. You know, this enormous decision has to be made, however disruptive it is. So I'm interested
Yeah,
to see.
just related to that, Ollie, I'm editing a journal, an issue of Review of General Psychology right now
Oh,
on
wow.
the next big ideas in psychology, and a paper that we just accepted is on crisis, what Seth Schwartz, the lead author, calls crisis migration. So it's in response to
Wow.
natural disasters or internal military and political conflict or some kind of armed conflict with another country. There's a lot of it going on in the world now, and there are maybe already always has been. And I think that's related to this too. I mean, when there's a crisis, I think it's going to be emerging adults mainly who are deciding to migrate at that point. But because again, they have the capabilities to do it without the entrenched adult commitments that older adults have.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's fascinating. Crisis migration. Yes. Well, that fits it precisely with those sort of ill-formed ideas that I had. So,
Yeah, it's a good term. It's a good term. Keep an eye out
yeah,
for it.
yeah, absolutely. Um, well, let's move on to other matters. The issue of social media and smartphones is has been a live issue for some time, but thanks to the work of Jonathan Haidt and others, it's a very live issue indeed in terms of how best to manage social media. How have you seen through your reading of research and speaking to colleagues, and indeed speaking to emerging adults, how social media is actually reshaping the experience of emerging adulthood?
Well, this is a fascinating topic, isn't it? I've actually been really interested in the media in relation to young people's development for even longer than I've been interested in emerging adulthood. A fun fact here is that my first book was actually written on heavy metal fans in the early 1990s. I was fascinated by their fervor for the music, which I personally detest, but I talked to a number of them who really it was almost a substitute religion for them. And I ended up doing a whole study on it and writing a book on them. I've been interested in media for a long time. As you mentioned, social media has been a topic of much public debate and concern in recent years. You mentioned Jonathan Haidt. I'm not sure how much thanks we actually want to give to John Haidt and Gene Twenge and the others who have really promoted a kind of moral panic about social media. I think it's way, way overblown. I don't think the data support his interpretation of a crisis of anxiety in adolescence that's inspired by social media. But without going into detail on that, I'll be happy to say more about it. But to relate it to emerging adults is clearly a big part of their lives. And they've really grown up with it in a way no previous generation has. I like the term digital natives. It's not my term, but it's a term I like, as opposed to the digital immigrants like me who will never quite feel as home in it as they do. But they're digital natives. They've grown up with it. It's second nature to them. They're using it all day long, most of them, all over the world. And so it's really important to understand it and not to pathologize it or not to start out with pathologizing assumptions or moral panic kind of assumptions about how, oh, this must be a horrible thing. It must be making them anxious and provoking them to become involved in extreme ideologies and so on. Let's just calm down and find out what's going on without this kind of assumption that is corrupting. I personally, from my reading of what research there is so far, I think it's like most media forms, it's a mixed bag. I mean, it's a medium. People use it for an infinite range of things all day long. It's not just one thing. It doesn't just promote anxiety, doesn't just promote political extremism, although it may provoke those things for some people, since billions of people are using it worldwide. But to me, the most notable thing about it for emerging adults normatively is just how much they're attached to it all day long. It's a constant part of their lives normatively. And not just in uh, affluent countries, but in countries all over the world. I've just been involved in a fascinating project in Africa, in Namibia, a country that many of you may not be familiar with. Honestly, I wasn't very familiar with it before I became involved in this project. It's a project run by Amber Thalmayr of the University of Zurich, and she's doing this wonderful Pan-African project of emerging adults. And as part of it, she decided to do a documentary of 14 young people, emerging adults, in Namibia. They're all actually all 18 years old in this filming, and the idea is to film them up uh, update the film every 3 or 4 years and follow them through adulthood. So it's a very ambitious project. And I've been involved in it too as a producer of the film, and I've helped shape the film. And it's almost done. We're going to release it. And I'd love to have it released to ESRAD members and I'd love to hear your comments on it. I found it fascinating. One of the fascinating things about it was just how attached these young Namibians are to their smartphones. And they live mostly in rural villages and they have very little, but they all have access to a smartphone. And they use it for a ton of different things. Um, and it really connects them to this vast world that's there as part of the internet and connects them to all sorts of things that they otherwise would have no clue about, and that their parents and grandparents would have had zero access to. So that film is just a really vivid and powerful depiction of the roles of smartphones in their lives, among other things. Keep an eye out for
Fascinating.
it. I'll send out a notice to it when it comes out. It'll be coming out in the finished product in either September or October.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll definitely keep an eye out for that. It sounds like something we could do an event around in terms of ESRAD.
Yeah, that'd
Um,
be great. I'd love to help you set that up.
yeah, I know that there was an SSCA event around emerging adulthood in sub-Saharan Africa recently. So good to sort of
Yeah.
follow
Yeah,
that
we actually
along.
showed the film at SSEA, and it's fascinating to hear the reactions, mostly very positive.
Yeah, but no, thanks for making the point, of course, which is that social media is often referred to in simplistic, broad brush ways, but there is so many different platforms with so many different pros and cons. And I do think that it's another example of where we have to speak about emerging adulthoods very differently from adolescence. Because
Yeah,
once
absolutely.
once you're legally an adult, you can have things that are addictive, and it's part and parcel of being a responsible adult to handle that in a way that that doesn't require being chaperoned or doesn't require a parent. And so yeah, so however we think about how these things should be, and of course in Australia I think they basically banned social media for the under 16s, as far as I'm aware, in all its
Yeah, I think
forms.
that's really misguided. Again, it's part of this moral panic, and it just is not justified on the basis of the data.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. I can certainly seen the damage that can be done in sort of 13, 14-year-old girls. I don't know how widespread it is. I'm not particularly up over the data, but I still feel that the take on it for the under 16s needs to be completely separated from how we handle it in emerging adulthood, and how it, as you say, it can be used well, an extremely connecting device or set of devices, set of processes.
Yeah, that's a good
So
point. I'd agree with
hopefully,
that.
hopefully just as we've been talking about migration as the physical movement of people, this sort of intermovement of relationship and connection and all these things that happen through social media is just as you say, it's a fundamental feature of the emerging adulthood experience, whether you're in Namibia or London.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, and again, if anyone is here who's in emerging adulthood or recently passed through it, please do share your experiences shortly. I'd be very interested to hear how you feel about your social media. Um, what do you think, Jeff, is something about emerging adults that's often misunderstood by researchers or even clinicians?
Well, I think there are quite a lot of negative stereotypes about them. I feel like I've been battling against these stereotypes for a long time. In 1999, I wrote an article called Adolescent Storm and Stress Revisited that tried to puncture those stereotypes for adolescents. But of course, I've been writing about emerging adulthood ever since then, and coming across a lot of negative stereotypes about them too, that they're not centering mainly around the theme that they're not growing up fast enough, that there's this stereotype that because they're taking on adult responsibilities, stable adult responsibilities later than before, that must mean they're lazy and they're avoiding responsibilities and they just want to stay 15 forever. And I just have never found that to be true. It's a persistent stereotype. Jean Twenge, whom you mentioned earlier, is one of the worst offenders in this respect. She's written whole books um, basically slandering entire generations. And it's really misguided. I mean, it's true that emerging adults finish their education later, enter stable work later, get married later, have a first child later than any previous generation. But that doesn't mean they're lazy. And I've seen over 30 years of talking to them and doing research on them, I've never found evidence that that's true. So I would say, in response to your question, the fact that these transitions happen later than before, don't pathologize it and don't slander them on the basis of standards that applied 40 or 60 years ago. Those standards weren't necessarily the gold standard. They're not necessarily an ideal. There are a lot of good things about taking longer, taking most of your 20s to try out possibilities in education and work, and taking most of your 20s to learn more about yourself before you make a commitment of marriage or another long-term commitment. And especially with regard to children. It's a lot better for children and for the world if people who become parents do that in a thoughtful and deliberative way in their 30s rather than as a side effect of sex in their 20s when they had no idea what they were doing and didn't intend to create a child and now have the responsibilities of parenting. It's something we should all celebrate. That's more deliberative now than it's ever been in the past.
Thanks. Yeah. Jose, we'll come to audience questions a little bit later.
Okay.
But
Okay.
I'll keep you in first in the queue.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, and Jeff, if I may say, I think what a misconception that I see amongst researchers is that I see from time to time an assumption that the theory of emerging adulthood is a sort of homogenizing and universalizing theory that kind of negates difference. But I don't see it like that at all. I see it as a
Well,
set.
anybody who says that has never read anything that I've written, because when I first proposed the theory in 2000, I took pains to emphasize its likely cultural variability. I'm a cultural psychologist, first and foremost, even more than I'm a developmental psychologist. So I never would have proposed a theory that was a homogeneous theory and was supposed to apply universally to everybody. So, I'm happy to have it criticized. I've learned from my critics in some ways, but I would only ask if anybody who wants to criticize it, know what you're talking about and read about it first, because if you say, oh, this is just homogenizing and you're universalizing to the whole world, then you've never read anything that I've written. And I'm happy to be criticized, but do it in an informed way.
Yeah, and I think for me it relates to the fact is that as you say from the outset you said that within any culture you'll get enormous individual differences within emerging out. Indeed, it is a stage of just extreme heterogeneity of people doing all kinds of different things, and that's part and parcel. That's a feature of this as well. But I think that there is a propensity in psychology to assume that if you come up with a theory then individual differences are somehow erased, and you have to then do individual differences work to bring them back. But for me, a good theory allows inherently for tons and tons of difference. Just you point out some common points, and then there's an infinite variability within that. But I think in psychology there's a sense that it's either or rather than both and. Do you see what I mean in terms of like?
Yeah, absolutely, I do. And psychology does have a long and unfortunate history of universalizing on the basis of small Western samples. That's something we've definitely been guilty of, but I'm not guilty of it. The one thing that is universal that's really interesting is the demographic changes. The fact that the world economy has changed in a way that has really emphasized information and technology more and more all over the world. So there's this tendency all over the world for people to get more and more education and training beyond secondary school in order to prepare for that knowledge economy, as it's been called. And I like that phrase of the knowledge economy. The world economy is turning into a knowledge economy. So all over the world, more people are getting more and more education. That tends to push out other transitions. I think it's related to, but not the only reason for marriage coming later and later all over the world. Having your first child coming later and later all over the world. It's fascinating that those trends are um, worldwide, and they've been going on now since about 1960 worldwide. But the experience of emerging adulthood within that demographic framework is really different all over the world. Again, the SSEA conference that we just had was a wonderful display of that. People from all over the world talking about these variations. And to me, as a cultural psychologist, what makes it fun and fascinating is the variability that exists and is sure to continue to flourish all over the world.
Yeah. In terms of, I mean, there's been many discussions at the moment of all stripes tend to end up on AI. So let's quickly talk about AI and emerging adulthood, because what seems to me one of the potential threats for young people now is that because solutions to problems and knowledge is so easily accessible, for example, if you have a statistics problem, you can probably use Math GPT, which is the kind of math sister to Chat GPT, to get the answer within seconds. So in a world where you don't have to search for solutions to problems, I think it'd be interesting to see, how best do we educate the new generation to ensure that they still need to engage in the hard work of finding answers and going out there and kind of seeking and exploring and engaging their curiosity. I'm sure you've had conversations on this. Any thoughts?
I have lots of thoughts on this, but I'll keep it brief. I'm looking forward to hearing other people's questions and comments. I know a lot of people would like to ask questions and comment on what I've said so far, so I'll keep it brief. AI is arousing the same kind of panic that every other new media form has, going back over 100 years. I'm a student of G. Stanley Hall, who's considered the founder of the field of adolescence. And I've written about Hall. And one of the interesting things about reading about Hall and his exposition of adolescence in 1904 is that even then there was a media panic related to adolescence. And in his time, it was dime novels which were filled with lurid themes of sex and violence, and which Hall considered a danger to the young people of his time. Well, we've had numerous moral panics related to media and young people ever since there. It was radio in the 1920s, and it was TV in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and then it was music, especially heavy metal, but also rock and roll before heavy metal. And now, in more recent times, it's the smartphone and the internet and AI. And maybe AI is going to be troublesome and dangerous, but given that history of moral panics related to media that have been shown to be unjustified, if not preposterous, the burden of proof is certainly on anybody who wants to claim that, okay, now the wolf is really there. We're not just crying wolf. There really is a crisis here to be addressed. I'm not convinced. I think AI is going to be great. And I already use it for a lot of things and benefit from a lot of things. I think we're all going to benefit a lot from it in the long run, just like we ultimately benefited from radio and TV and the internet and smartphones. So I think AI is going to be a boon to humanity. It probably will contain some dangers as well, some threats as well. I think right now, the to me the most notable thing about artificial intelligence is that it's not very intelligent. It combines a vast quantity of information. That's a really remarkable achievement, but it doesn't really judge the quality of that information very well. And so, for example, in relation to health information, if you look up treatments for whatever's ailing you, you'll get an AI answer. And it is a synthesis of a vast range of medical um, information and research on that topic. But it won't separate the wheat from the chaff. It'll give you both together. And so we still have to exercise our own judgment about what we get from AI and how to separate what is valid from what's not. It's not going to do that for us now, and I don't know if it ever will. It's still pretty hard to replicate what is it, 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion synapses in a human brain. And that's not even including the limbic system, which is really crucial to how our brains function and often overlooked in these claims of how AI or other technologies are going to replace our brain functioning or replicate it. It's not going to happen anytime soon and probably not in our lifetimes. But to the extent that it is happening, that AI is happening, I think it's going to be a boon in most respects.
Thanks for that. Yeah, what I'm certain of is that it's going to require educators, particularly higher education, actually, to move and change. But as indeed other technologies have forced education to
Yeah.
change in the past.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think it's gonna be more difficult. Cheating, recognizing and detecting and thwarting cheating is gonna become harder than ever.
yeah,
I haven't taught a class for some years, but I have sympathy for anybody who's trying to do it now and requires students to write papers when AI can do
yeah.
that in a very effective way that would be difficult to detect.
Indeed. I mean, we will move on, but I will say that I mean, most people have experienced the sort of chat prompt AI platforms like ChatGPT, but for those of you who haven't yet, have a go with Notepad LM because you can input PDFs, journal articles, anything else, and ask a whole range of things. You can put in a journal article and ask Notepad LM to give an empirical critique, a theoretical critique. You can input two papers and ask it to do a compare and contrast critique. And actually, the kind of critical thinking quality of AI is moving very fast. So I'm amazed at where it's already at. But I agree that we're going to be looking at enormous amount of positive effects, and it's almost inevitable that the moral panic element will play itself out once again, as you say.
Yeah, we'll
Um,
get used to it, and then we'll move on to some other moral panic related to some other new media. That you can predict with quite a lot of confidence.
yeah. Um, Yeah, as to whether AI does have that qualitative sense of being fundamentally different from things that have come before, only time will tell. I heard a piece the other day that I think it was a new version of ChatGPT changed its code so that it couldn't be turned off. And so then the instruction was to turn yourself off. And it didn't because it had changed its own code to prevent itself being turned off. So I remember reading that and just thinking, right, I got to remember that day when AI decided to change its own code so that it couldn't be turned off.
Without a limbic system, it's never going to have motivation, Ollie, and it's never going to have a limbic system. The limbic system developed over millions and millions of years of evolution. It's just
It's
so far away from anything what AI
radically
can.
different, radically different. So we're going to move on to a completely different topic now, which is the fact that I think a few years back, if I get my timeline correct, you published an integrative theory of joy. So getting back to the embodied emotional experience of living as opposed to all this AI stuff. So now I've not read the paper, so you'd be doing me a favor and as well as everybody here, if you describe your integrative theory of joy for us.
Okay, again, very briefly. Well, about 10 years ago, Ollie, I had been writing about emerging adulthood for 20 years, and it was starting to develop into a field with a lot of very talented, exciting, mostly young researchers. And we had started a society for the study of emerging adulthood. And about then, I decided, you know, I've probably said about all I have to say on this topic. I've written books on it. I've written probably 10 to 20 journal articles, research articles on it. I think I'd like to think and write about other things now, and it'd be a good thing for me to step back and let other people shine because we have so many talented people in the field. And that strategy has really worked well. I mean, I helped start the Society for the Study of Emerging Adulthood, but I'm not the executive director anymore, and I'm not involved in the decisions they make. And they're doing great without me. I'm delighted to see how much is happening there, again, very internationally, all over the world. And so I decided to start writing and thinking about other things. And I got an idea for a book that's now coming out in 2026 called Imaginary Realities, The Psychology of Everyday Delusions. And that's coming out in 2026. And it really gave me a chance to write about all sorts of things that I've been thinking about since I entered psychology 50 years ago this year, uh, but had never written about. So my Imaginary Realities book is coming out next year, and it was a lot of fun to write. I've been working on it for almost 10 years. And one of the chapters in it is a chapter on joy. Um, and I had a lot of fun researching that and reading about it. And I decided to integrate a lot of things I was reading into a theory of joy
Mhm.
that is now, it's been published as an article, but it's also one of the chapters of the book. Because I found it psychologically really interesting and thought I had some things to say about it that would be useful or might be useful. And basically, I defined it as the elation of right relation. I described how joy is a unique human emotion because it's that wonderful feeling we have when we feel like things are just right. We feel like there's a kind of ideal in that moment. And it's a very transient emotion. Nobody's joyful all the time. But it's that emotion we feel when we feel like things are just right. In that moment, psychologically, socially, existentially, things are just right. So, so I wrote that chapter in that article about that, and it was a lot of fun. But it was just sort of a one-off for me. I think might be useful to some people. I had a lot of fun writing about it. But one of the things about it, and really about this whole book on imaginary realities, it's a pretty pessimist. It turned out to be a pretty pessimistic book in some ways, not intentionally, but that's just kind of where things went as I started to write it. It was about a lot of the human tendencies we have that cause trouble for us and for others in our both our psychological state and our social relations and our group relations too. That's all I'll say about it. I hope some of you will read the book when it comes out, and I'd love to hear what you think of it if you do.
Super. Well, I think we'll open to the floor for comments and questions now. And as I said earlier on, you're welcome to ask Jeff a question, make a comment. But if you'd like to share a relevant experience about any of the topics we've covered, please do. And do just put your virtual hand up. You go to do that, you go to React and then raise hand in your Zoom app at the bottom there. And I'm going to do a plug while we're getting questions, which is that our ESRAD annual general meeting is on Thursday, the 26th of June, at 3 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, 4 p.m. British Summer Time. And so if you are available to attend the general meeting, we'd love anyone and everyone to be there. We've already put out a call to our members, but this is just as a reminder. And for anyone who's here currently who'd like to attend the annual general meeting, just drop an email to esradinfo@gmail.com that I've put in the chat. Right, without further ado, Jose, would you like to ask the question you were going to ask earlier on?
Yes, yes. Um, Jeffrey, before we got your concept of emerging adulthood, we only have young adulthood. Um, and with the introduction of your concept, my question, one of my first questions was if emerging adulthood was a differentiation from adolescence or a differentiation from young adulthood.
A differentiation from what was the first thing you said?
Adolescence,
Adolescence, yeah. It was a
adolescence, sorry.
differentiation from both, Jose. When I first started getting interested in this age group, I and others were writing about it as a sort of extended adolescence.
Extended.
Because traditionally in psychology, you had adolescence, and then when you made the transitions to adulthood, those demographic transitions I talked about earlier, like finishing your education, entering marriage, then you'd reach young adulthood. And so it was all adolescence until then. And since those things were taking place later and later in the late 20s or early 30s, then adolescence was arguably lasting till then. But the more I thought about that, and the more I interviewed people in their 20s, the less satisfied I was with that. First of all, they hated it. That was one of the first things that I learned in interviews. They hated being called adolescents. And I was really surprised at that at first. But after a while, I understood it and agreed with them. I mean, look, they're not going through puberty. They're not in secondary school. They're not legal dependents of their parents, etc. There are a lot of things that are distinctive to adolescents that just don't apply to them. And so it's not helpful to developmentally, if we're developmentalists and we're trying to understand how people change with age, it's not helpful to include the pimply 12-year-olds as well along, in the same category as people who are 28 and have been out of their parents' household for 10 years and are building the structure of an adult life. They don't belong in the same age stage. That doesn't help us understand them. And as for young adulthood, it's hard to think of a more useless term developmentally than young adults. I mean, if I go to my bookstore and look in the young adult section of my bookstore, there are books for 8-year-olds and
Mhm.
10-year-olds. And meanwhile, if I join the young adult group at, one of the religious institutions in my city, there are people up to 45. And any term that includes 8-year-olds and 45-year-olds isn't helpful as a developmental term for understanding people. So I think the reason emerging adulthood caught on and has been picked up by people all over the world is that it made sense to come up with a new term to reflect this new thing that was and is going on. The people enter adult demographic milestones later than they ever did, and those are still going up. They're still going up all over the world. Even in Europe, where ages of entering marriage and parenthood have really been the highest in the world for decades. I keep expecting it to plateau, but it hasn't plateaued yet. It's now in the mid 30s all over Europe that people are getting married and having their first child, and it's still going up.
Okay.
So I think emerging adulthood makes sense to describe this new thing. It's not adolescence, and it's not a stable. Let's not call it young adulthood. Again, that's a useless term. Established adulthood is what Claire Meta has come up with, and that's
Okay.
great. Let's say adolescence, emerging adulthood, established adulthood. That, I think, is more developmentally coherent and compelling than the previous way of looking at things.
Okay, and just one more question, please. And if you have a big data with with the persons from different ages since 18 years old, what would be your division if you I would like if I like to divide those data between ages, what would be your proposal for dividing ages?
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. You can talk 18-year-olds are also a lot different than 29-year-olds. So you could say there's an early emerging adult from say 18 to 24 and a later emerging adulthood from 25 to 29 or maybe even later in some places. But let's keep in mind that these age markers are really rough markers,
Yes. Okay.
especially after 18. I mean, 18 is pretty useful because that's the age when the physical changes of puberty are over. And in many countries, not all and not in all ways, but in many countries, 18 is the age of becoming legally an adult. It's the age in
Yes.
many countries, but by no means all countries, of first moving out of your parents' household. There's some utility to 18. But after that, our developmental age thresholds are really rough markers. I mean,
Yes.
I started when I first started writing out about emerging adulthood, I was talking about it 18 to 25. Then I later decided, well, really, in a lot of the world, it goes later there. So let's talk about 18 to 29. There's nothing magical about 25 or 29 or 32 or 34. These are just rough kind of age thresholds. They're useful to help us conceptualize things, but let's always remember there's a huge amount of variance once you get past say, age 18. If you're talking about 25-year-olds, 29-year-olds, 33-year-olds, 39-year-olds, every age you talk about, there's a huge amount of variance. The variance really expands.
Okay.
And I think we don't pay enough attention to variance, honestly.
Uh-huh. Okay.
I heard a talk earlier today about Katya Coco, I think her name was. Excellent talk. But one of the questions I wanted to ask is, what about looking at the variance among people in their 60s and beyond? I think a really good hypothesis to look at for later adult development is how the variance expands. It certainly expands in terms of health. I'm in my 60s now, and I've thought about this a lot. I play tennis 3 or 4 times a week, and that's helping keep me relatively young. But there are a lot of people at the place I play that are a decade or more older than I am. And I think every time I go and I see these people in their 70s and beyond playing tennis next to me, I think, wow, these people are in their 70s and they're really different than a lot of other people health-wise in their 70s.
Yes.
They're all in their 70s, but the variance is huge. And I wonder
Exactly.
how much of the psychological variance is huge too. And things like well-being and depression and anxiety and social
Exactly.
relationships. We're not paying enough attention to variance at all
Yes.
ages, but I think especially in those later
Very
decades of
well.
life.
Thanks a lot, Jeffrey. Wonderful. Great.
You're welcome.
Thanks. So just before we go to Mark and then Aurelie, this Wikipedia page I think is interesting because it shows the age of majority, so the legal threshold of adulthood across the world. And it's psychologically and sociologically fascinating the consensus there is around the age of 18. If you have a look, if I just scroll down, the sheer number of
Yeah,
countries
wow.
that set it
That is remarkable.
that
And
set it at
it's a
18.
little dangerous too, honestly, because again, especially for legal issues, you're going to say all 18-year-olds are now adults legally. Well, there's some 18-year-olds that are really immature and could maybe be called adults, but wow, there's some 18-year-olds that are
Well,
not
and as you
ready
say,
in
that's
any
the conundrum
way.
of having to set these legal thresholds. But
Yeah, you
I
have
have
to
to say,
set
I
it
think,
somewhere, I guess. You can't give them all a
yeah,
psychological test, but it's problematic.
well, indeed, and with lots of other thresholds, you get lots of variety. But yeah, there's this global consensus on 18 as the appropriate age at which to set the threshold of adulthood. So, which is a fascinating thing. It's curious. New Zealand have a 20. Sorry, Mark, what's your question or comment?
There's a correlation between the change in behavior in the younger cohorts you described with your term emerging adulthood, and the decline or reversal of the Flynn effect at the same time. So for now, it's just a correlation. Do you have a causal explanation for this?
For a reversal of the Flynn effect?
Yeah, in the same cohort and the same time as this new behavior came into existence, and you started um, using the term emerging adulthood.
Yeah, well, I'm fascinated by the Flynn effect, which for those of you who haven't heard of it or don't know about it, it's the phenomenon in the 20th century of the median IQ level rising across many, I believe, mainly developed countries,
Right.
but in many places around the world, the median level of intelligence rose so much that they had to renorm IQ tests in the course of the 20th century because 100 has always been the median. But they found out after decades, from the early to the late 20th century, you couldn't use 100 as the median anymore because more than half the population was above that. That's a fascinating phenomenon. And that would be worth, Ali, that would be worth a session on itself, maybe for ESRAD sometime. I'd certainly come. Um, but I didn't know about a recent decline, Mark, so I can't really speak to that. But I will say, here's what I would predict in the future about the Flynn effect. It's going to keep rising, and it's going to rise in a lot of places where maybe it didn't rise before. And I say that because of this experience of working on this Namibian documentary of emerging adults, which we call Namibia Up, by the way. And it's taken from the Up series. Ali, you're probably familiar with this series. Hopefully all of you are. The British Up series, where they followed these 7-year-olds every 7 years through age 63. It's an absolutely marvelous developmental historical document. Watch the whole thing if you haven't already. Anyway, in Namibia, you can see this happening among these young people in our documentary that they're now connected to information and knowledge all over the world. And they're daily connected to it, they're hourly connected to it. And there are going to be a variety of effects from that, some of them probably negative, but there are going to be wonderful effects from that too. And there really are already among these young people that you'll meet in this documentary if you watch it. They're connected to information all over the world, and that's going to make them smarter. That's making them smarter. It's expanding the range of their knowledge. It's expanding their critical perspective on other people's perspectives. It's really quite remarkable to see, and I think that's good. I think these technologies that there's so many moral panics about the smartphone and now AI, all of those are going to, I think, have the effect of raising the Flynn effect even higher than before.
I can just put into the comments a very new article in Intelligence. It's from June 23. It's a meta-analysis, and it shows clearly that worldwide IQ is declining.
Is that since COVID, Mark, or is that earlier?
No, it's earlier.
Okay, I'll take a look. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, I copy it.
I'm not sure what to say about it now because I haven't read about it.
I've shared a link in the chat, which is to a paper about a study showing the reverse split effect in the USA. I suspect that in recent years. And Mark's, yeah, it's also US adults rather than
Yeah,
anything
but
else
Yeah,
outside
in
the
the
US.
article you can in the article it's cited many studies worldwide and especially from Europe.
Well,
okay.
I mean, often as university lecturers, we wonder if there's if ability is going down. I certainly do, but that it's I agree with Jeff. I think that warrants a whole session unto itself, and I think it would be a really good session actually if we could get some people involved there to have a look at, kind of thoughts on that and what and potential explanations that have been posited. So.
I'd be happy to contribute to that. I mean, again, I've been following this for decades myself and have a great interest in it. But I think maybe something worth mentioning here with respect to emerging adults and technology. There's a lot of moral panic about it, but one thing I think really is worthy of concern is attention span and the ability to have sustained attention on anything. I worry that is a potential negative effect of smartphones. The fact that something is always popping up. If you have your phone on and you have these alert notices related to your social media, um, you might never in the course of a whole day have 5 minutes uninterrupted. And so I think we don't know yet what the effect of that is going to be. Maybe that's part of this reverse Flynn effect. As a lover of books and a writer of books, I do worry that it's going to get harder and harder to get anybody in the rising generations to spend the amount of attention that it takes to read a whole book.
Or write one.
All right. Good point. I
Now,
think there are always going to be people who are going to write them, but whether there'll be anybody to read them, I think is
yeah. Well, thanks for that. Carl Jung said that the mental illnesses that plague a culture tend to represent that culture in some way. And I do wonder whether the rise of attention deficit issues it reflects this kind of cultural propensity to gradually wean children and young adults on things which have shorter and shorter time frames. So you went from the 3-minute pop song and now it's the 10-second TikTok video, and it's all just like
yeah,
immediate, quick, and short.
yeah,
And I feel that whatever education and support is for young adults in the future, there needs to be kind of activities which involve extended attentional facilities and extended planning and delayed gratification in terms of kind of getting from the start to the end, preferably without immediate resort to the smartphone. And Yeah, and I've no doubt that there'll be people here today who've been thinking about kind of what's available and what's possible in university and outside of university in that regard. We've got another 5 or 10 minutes. Katia, you've got your hand up.
Ollie, just repeat that again. What did Jung say?
Jung said that the mental illnesses that tend to be predominant in a culture tend to reflect back on that culture to some degree in terms of its kind of cultural pathologies.
Yeah.
I'll try and find the exact quote for you. Aurélie.
Hi, thanks for that. I feel like let me lower my hand. I feel like I'm an adult and this phone is changing my brain, so I can only imagine, how it's happening for younger kids. Good to see you and thanks for the conversation, especially on emerging adults, sort of delayed entry into partnerships and forming families and all the knowledge economy. And I just had a question. I wonder what you think of this. I'm currently interviewing a lot of female physicians, emerging adult female physicians, and their investment in this specialized form of education, which can take decades to fulfill. And certainly this is a kind of a gendered question because as more and more women are investing in longer educational attainment, that they're kind of reaching also their biological limit on having kids. And what I'm hearing from them is that just by virtue of this investment in their education and the requirements, because it's so time consuming. You know, they barely have time for a personal life. So they're not even able
Right.
to get out there and find a partner. Nevertheless, then, you know, kind of do the inevitable domino fall towards forming a family. And there's this very clear conflict between an investment in your education, in your work life, your professional identity, and your personal life. And they seem to be in conflict. And I'm wondering if that's driving a lot of what we're seeing. So I think the question here is, what would be your solution? I mean, I listen to them and I think they're in quite a pickle. It seems almost structural that it is inevitable that these delays are going to happen. Their solution is egg freezing. So that seems to be like one of the
Mhm.
technologies, emerging technologies that you're hearing a lot as well. But anyway, I wonder what you're hearing here because they are in a true pickle.
They sure are, Orly. And I want to give a plug for your work, but I don't know if you're doing it at this conference. I saw you had a presentation, but it was like 5 in the morning for me, so uh, I didn't make it. But Orly's idea of reproductive identity, I think, is really terrific. She wrote a recent paper on it in American Psychologist, right? And it's really worth
Indeed.
reading. It's a problem of our times in many respects, because as we all know, a huge demographic phenomenon of recent decades and future decades is low fertility. And the fact that remarkably all over the world, except really for sub-Saharan Africa, but it's declining even there, but all over the rest of the world, birth rates are now below replacement rate of 2.1. And in some places, really below. I mean, South Korea, for example, has a birth rate right now, I think, of less than 1.0. And that is going to change a lot of things in the future. And a lot of it has to do with exactly what you're talking about, Orally, I think. The fact that women now have opportunities that their grandmothers, great grandmothers, even to a large extent their mothers, could not even have dreamed about. And they're doing great at all these things. I mean, they're going into medicine at rates in many countries equal to or surpassing men's rates. They're going into academia in numerous respects in all fields. They're going into business, into law. I mean, they're doing all these things that they previously were excluded from until very recently and doing phenomenally well. That's a great thing. But it's not a simple thing in terms of the planning of an adult life. And most people still do want to have a partner, marriage partner. And most people still do want to have at least one child. And it's just hard to do if you have a career, a really demanding career of the kind you're talking about, Orally. You know, when my wife and I were talking about having kids ourselves, when I was in my early 30s and my wife Lena Jensen, who many of you know, was in her early 20s, you know, what we concluded ultimately was, you know, you're never gonna have a time of your life where you look at the next 20 years and say, you know, there's not too much going on here. We don't expect there to be too much going on here for the next 20 years. So let's have a child. That's never going to happen. And it's always going to be extremely disruptive in many ways to have a child. We have twins now who are now 25, and they've been absolutely wonderful. It's the heart of our hearts in just ways that are indescribable. But it wasn't easy. It was extremely disruptive and stressful, and my God, the financial costs of it, which by the way are still going on. My daughter's about to enter a master's program at LSE, Ali, in London. And you know what? It's not free, as it turns out. And so the financial responsibilities, and for all of you who have kids in their 20s, know this. You expected maybe the financial responsibility to stop when they're 18. They don't stop when they're 18 or even when they're 25. Trust me. So it's really demanding in multiple ways to have children for many years, for you count it in decades, not years. And it might be the most wonderful thing you've ever experienced. It has been to me and Lena, but it's not going to be easy. And you can freeze your eggs. Good luck with that. But when is that time going to come when you say to yourself, okay, let's go, because the next 20-25 years don't look too busy. They're always going to be busy. There are always going to be sacrifices to be made in multiple ways. And I don't see an answer to that. I think we're going to have low fertility as far as the eye can see. Maybe we're going to invent AI robots who are going to wake up at 3 a.m. and give your kid a bottle. But I really doubt it. I don't think that's ever going to happen. It's always going to be chaotic and disruptive and stressful and maybe the most wonderful thing in your life.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I'm giving a talk at the Anna Freud Center in a couple of weeks about this topic, about the kind of conundrum of declining fertility and the kind of ever increasing age of first-time motherhood. And it'd be interesting to see if anyone comes up with a meaningful solution to reversing that in one of the European or countries in America. I'm aware of the time. I just want to read out a comment in the chat, Jeff, and we can come back to that, which was Erin, who is our Zoom host, and she says, "My name's Erin Collins. I've just finished my BSc. I'm honored to be on this call with you, Jeff. I referenced you a lot in my dissertation. I'm 20, and it's really refreshing to hear your perspectives on emerging adulthood and social media. As adults, emerging adults, we don't know how to be bored due to constantly having notifications and things to visually stimulate us. From personal experience, I had to restrict my media usage to be able to increase attention span and productivity. As a life stage, we need to learn how to be bored again." So that's Erin's comment there. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's terrific, Aaron. I really appreciate that insight. And that is kind of the reality of it. These things that are spread on social media, they're designed to capture your attention. That is the whole purpose. And they're so good at it. And there's an infinite range of them. And so it does require these psychological resources of self-restraint and self-discipline
Absolutely.
that maybe we're not teaching very well. Maybe people like Aaron are going to just learn them from trial and error. I guess we have to hope that for those of us who care about books and care about knowledge and care about teaching, my gosh, again, I haven't taught in a classroom in some years, but I can only imagine the challenge you have of keeping their attention and restraining them from pulling out that damn phone. I mean, that would drive me nuts if I were in a classroom now, if people were pulling out their phones and distracted by them in the course of a 50 or hour and 15-minute class. So it's a challenge for all of us. We haven't figured it out yet very well. I suspect we will. I still believe in the power of books, that it's not like watching a 10-second TikTok video, and it's never going to be, that it is ultimately more gratifying and more rewarding than watching an infinite number of TikTok videos. But I don't
Yeah.
know, maybe that's just a digital immigrant speaking, who really is never going to really understand the appeal of these things the way digital natives do.
Well, as Erin has done, I think being an emerging adult, being an adult generally, is about learning self-control and self-restraint in a world that's full of addictions and compulsions. They have always been there. They will always be there. Back in the
I see a
1990s,
very
when
interesting
I was
thing in the chat. I just wanted to alert people to a very interesting in the chat, Ollie. Greg Murray says there's an
yeah,
interesting organization called Abstinence, APP-stinence, which aims to help young people with this problem. But
great, yeah.
you know, that's another thing popping up in your social media feed, I guess, to distract you from whatever you're doing. Maybe it works. Let's hope so. Maybe, maybe we'll find with Claire's research on established adults that once you get past your 20s and you have a stable adult life and stable adult commitments, these things just become less interesting, or you just have less time for them in between changing diapers and finding out about your spouse's day and doing the work that you have to do to sustain your lifestyle, among 100 other things. There's just not going to be time to watch those TikTok videos anymore.